Okay, so welcome to Retech, and today we're going to have a quick look at the Commodore 128. Now, it's just a follow-on from the restoration of the keyboard and case, which you may have seen on the previous episode, and it's literally to give a quick overview of the machine and the differences between this and the Commodore 64. And the intention is to do some more videos covering the 128 and the Commodore 64 and its more technical features, and hopefully to get you into the mood to do some more programming on these machines, or even if you just want to learn about the more technical aspects of these Commodore machines. So I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you follow us on the next videos we do on the 128 and the Commodore 64, and I hope you follow the new series that will be coming up, which will be intermixed with normal videos on other machines. So let's take a look. Now, the Commodore 128 or the Commodore 128 shares a lot of similar kind of design traits to the Commodore Amiga. It's in a similar form factor case, has a very similar layout on the main keyboard aspects of it, and it's kind of very similar kind of colour aesthetics that the Amiga had when it was launched, especially the 500. Now, if you look at the keyboard, you might think it's very similar to the Commodore 64C, as in the colour, the style of keyboard. And you know, if you took away the actual keypad and the extra keys along the top, it would in fact look very similar. But it's nothing whatsoever like the way the 64C was actually built. The 64C came along a little bit later than the Commodore 128, so this machine was actually out first. And they both share very similar style of case, although the 64C is a little bit shortened because it hasn't got the numeric keypad and the extra keys along the top. Now, although they are very similar in colour and they're literally almost identical widths as well, which is quite surprising when you got to see that this one's got a numeric keypad on the end of it, which the 64C hasn't. But one thing that a lot of people don't really notice so much is the keyboards themselves. The Commodore 128 has what looks like a very similar keyboard, similar design. It's not. It's in no way the same. It's a very different design to the Commodore 64C. For example, the keys on the Commodore 128 are a lot more like the Commodore Amiga A500. They're very similar shape, they're very similar height, very similar feel to them, whereas the 64C has a very Commodore 64-esque keyboard. It has much more tactile response than the Commodore 128. It has taller keys, and it's arguably a lot better built as well. It's a lot nicer keyboard, although the Commodore 128 is very similar to a modern PC keyboard if you take this part of the keyboard. So although they do look very similar, they have similar creases, similar design style on the keyboards and the cases, they are in fact very different machines. The keyboard on the 64C is arguably a better keyboard than the 128. Again, that's down to preference and personal taste. But then again, the 64C was a little bit more cost cut if you compare that to the original one, because they have the ASCII or the PET ASCII symbols printed on the top, where the Commodore 128 still had them printed on the front of the keys instead. Very similar to the original Commodore 64 bread bin model. So they look very similar. They have the same design cues, but they're very different machines. And with the Commodore 128 as well, the overall on the overriding thing about the Commodore 128 is that it was almost 100% compatible with a Commodore 64. And as you can see here, it's quite happy running Commodore 64 software, and it will run most of the software very well. So a lot of people are going to be wondering what the point of the Commodore 128 was. Well, the Commodore 128 was really a stopgap machine. It was kind of to fill in the gap where the 64 left off and the Amiga came on board. So it was more of a case of trying to keep up with machines like the Sinclair Spectrum 128, the Amstrad 128 models, and a plethora of other machines that were upgrading to 128K. Now the 8-bit machines seem to have plateaued at about that memory size on average, and this was more than likely Commodore's answer to it. It wasn't a fantastic technical leap if you compare it to a Commodore 64 if you used the machine as a Commodore 64, because you got to remember that most of the software was already written and being produced for the base Commodore 64. Now the reason for that is because when you have millions of Commodore 64 users around the world and you write software, you're not going to start writing it for the handful of 128 users, and initially nobody knew how it was going to sell, so people kept on writing for the basic machine, which was basically a Commodore 64. So that kind of hamstrung the model a little bit, really. But that's not everything that the Commodore 128 was about. The Commodore 128 was also 3 separate machines. It had a Z80 processor, it could run CPM, it could run 80 column mode in 128 mode, and it had definite advantages. But when you use Commodore 64 mode, you got a Commodore 64. Basically all you got was this part of the keyboard that would actually do Commodore 64 mode. And nothing else on here really made any difference in that mode, so it was essentially just a Commodore 64. But I kind of guess if you were moving up from a 64 to a 128, you already had an extensive library of software. You more than likely had the peripherals to go with it, such as the disk drives and the printers, and they would happily sit working well on this machine. Now we're going to cover the major differences between this Commodore 128 and the Commodore 64 as we work through the next episode or two, but for now I'm just going to show you the physical differences of the machine. One of the first things you might notice is the power cord here, and those of you who have an Amiga A500 will kind of immediately recognize it as an almost Amiga 500 style power cord, and you will almost certainly recognize this as an Amiga 500 style power brick. So they carried a lot of the design aspect over to the Commodore Amiga. So the power brick used the same casing and same style, not exactly the same pinouts, but the same style connector for its power. Now the 128, the Commodore 128, shared a little bit of its design philosophy from the original machines, as the power cord was on the right hand side of the machine, and you had a reset switch on the right hand side in the joystick ports, as well as a on-off switch. Now this is kind of very similar to the original Commodore 64, which was unlike some of the other Commodore machines, such as the Plus 4, which had the power socket on the back of the machine, which is kind of a little bit more convenient rather than having things sticking out the side. And on the rear of the machine you have your expansion port, cassette port, serial, video, and on the NTSC version this would have been channel select. It's blanked out on the PAL, and you've got an RGBI and your user port. So a little bit different to the Commodore 64 and 64C, and it becomes a lot more useful. The only other feature which is very similar to all of the other Commodore models was your RF. So it wasn't overly endowed with ports, but it did make a difference, because your video out here is run composite, which is ideal for modern or slightly more modern LCD panels, and your RGBI, again, you can use it on a lot of flat panel monitors as well, but you can also get dedicated RGBI monitors. So everything else is very similar, including your serial for your disk drive interface as well. So nothing really changed on that side of it, but it's a nice looking machine. It's arguably a nicer machine than some of its contemporaries, and it's arguably a better spec machine than a lot of its contemporaries as well. And you know, it would have made a nice all-round machine, even for kind of semi-professional or even business use, because it had a nice layout on the keyboard. Things started to make sense with the way Commodore were laying its keyboards out now, and it was more in the line of a PC. I mean, the keyboard is very, very well laid out, very similar. But ultimately, 99.9% of people who bought one of these would have used it as a standard Commodore 64, in all honesty. There were very few software titles produced which relied on the use of the Commodore 128. There were very few CP/M titles that people would have really wanted to run on this. At the time, CP/M was kind of dead in the water. It had been dead for best part of 10 years before this machine actually came along. So not so sure why CP/M was really needed in here, and I don't particularly think the designers really knew that CP/M would actually be used in this machine. But again, it was a nice to have, especially if you use CP/M at work and then you wanted to bring your work home. Now there's one thing that I think Commodore or the designers may have regretted, was the fact that they didn't open their eyes to the way the industry was going with a standard. Because if you take a look at this Commodore 64C, now you take a look at the Commodore 128, and then you take a look at any of the bread bin style models here, the 16, the VIC-20, the VC-20, the Commodore 64 original, the Commodore 64G, and even the Commodore Plus 4, the 116. The one thing they have in common is a basic, if you pardon the pun, language, and that was Microsoft Basic. And each and every one of these machines can run, execute, load, save programs written in Microsoft Basic. The original version that was on the bread bin, the VIC-20, the PET, the 64, and so on. Even a Commodore Plus 4 would run anything written in that version of BASIC on that machine. And I've actually ran and installed and loaded something written in BASIC for a VIC-20 on a Commodore 64, and it runs fine. There are no issues with it. So as long as you keep to the original structure of Microsoft Basic, all of these machines will run exactly the same software. And that should have given a heads up to Commodore that these machines were the start, or could have been the start, of a standard across the range. Then they were on to a winner and probably the start of a set standard. But Commodore didn't think that far ahead. And the changes in BASIC, the differences in memory size, the non-standard execution of a lot of its ROMs, etc. that they installed in these machines, meant that they weren't compatible with each other to a degree where they would have been a standard. They were all incompatible, and mainly because they kept chopping and changing with hardware, whether it was the VIC, the VIC-2, the SID, and so on. Because under the hood, under the bonnet of each and every machine is a very similar processor, a very similar version of BASIC, very similar set of instructions, but it's just a shame that they didn't have the foresight to see what was coming. But you know, that's why we have the modern day PC. We have Android, and they seem to be setting more of the standard now than anything else that we kind of use on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this brief overview of the Commodore 128. And let's move forward and let's cover these machines in a lot more technical detail going forward, and we'll do this in between other videos that we do on different machines. So there's a lot more to come, so I hope you stick with us, and I hope you subscribe, and I'd like to see you again on this channel in the future. So thanks a lot, thank you for your time, goodbye.